In this class we're going to deal with corporate governance. In fact, what we're going to deal with more specifically is agency theory and look briefly at what's meant by agency theory and how it affects businesses. The idea of corporate governance is how are businesses controlled, how are businesses managed, and the responsibility of the business to its stakeholders, including its obligations to the wider society in which it operates. Because businesses operate in society because, in a sense, they are granted permission to do so. The society tolerate the businesses. There is a symbiosis in the relationship. The society benefits from having the businesses through having a wider choice of products and indeed essential products in the market, and also the businesses provide employment and resources for households. But in return, the society allow the businesses to function. So there is a mutual agreement in play that we don't often think about. But corporate governance itself is looking at how the businesses are controlled and how they behave within that society. As I said, we're going to focus in on agency theory. There are quite a few other theories and ideas in the literature associated with the topic of corporate governance. But agency theory focuses on the conflicting interests between the principals and the agents. If we think about businesses, again, businesses are owned by one set of people, the shareholders perhaps, but they're also managed by a different set of people, the managers, and they have conflicting interests. The managers want security of employment, but they also want high salaries and perks within their workplace and bonuses. But the principals of the business want security of investment and they want a high rate of return on their investment. So we can see there is a conflict between the two sides. And that's the subject matter of agency theory. It's trying to look at how the two sides fight out this battle and how they manage to survive and continue in business, recognizing that they have got conflicting interests. Stakeholder theory explores the dilemma regarding the interests of different groups of stakeholders. Stakeholder theory, in a sense, is wider than the agency theory. The agency theory focuses in on the managers and the owners, the principals and the agents. The agents being the managers, the principals being the owners. Stakeholder theory, by contrast, looks at the various stakeholders who are associated with the business. Could be, for example, the suppliers of raw materials or the suppliers of specialist machinery to that particular business. It could be the wider society, because the business is perhaps producing a product that has considerable amounts of pollution associated, or noise, or additional traffic on the roads. So the wider stakeholder, this needs to be taken into account as well when looking at the direction in which businesses are moving, the types of policies they're pursuing, and seeing who is affected and how does the business deal with the adverse effects of their policies on perhaps say the wider community or on particular groups of stakeholders. So stakeholders could be the employees, could be the managers themselves, could be the suppliers of raw materials, could be the wider community. It depends on how we define stakeholders, and that's the subject matter of other videos. Let's go back to agency theory, which is what we want to focus in on in this particular session. Boards of directors are appointed by shareholders to monitor and control managerial decision making to protect the stakeholders or the shareholders' interest. The shareholders in this case being the stakeholders we're particularly interested in. So what the shareholders do is appoint a board of directors. The board of directors is trying to control the business, trying to control the managers, to make sure that the managers are not exploiting their position, that the managers are working fairly and decently and honestly in the interest of the business and in the interest indeed of the shareholders who own the business. So they appoint a board of directors to try and bring this about. But of course then they need to control the board of directors. In particular, this monitoring role of the board of directors was expected to be effectively performed through independent, non-executive directors that the position that hold the positions, for example, of chairman and chief executive officer, and these should be held by different people as well. The chairman and the chief executive officer should be different. So the chances of collusion, collaboration, and in a sense cheating, an agreement on cheating between the two, cheating of the shareholders, or moving the business in a direction that's more to the advantage of the managers and to the management, to the advantage of the people who are working within the business, and away from the owners of the business. After all, the shareholders are not routinely involved in the business. They're not involved in the business on a day-to-day basis. Chances are the shareholders are investors. These are the people who put up the capital at the start to open the business or to develop the business. So the idea is to have a board of directors that monitor the managers, to try and get the managers to work in a way which is to the interest of the shareholders, but also the factor in various rules to try and keep the chairman and the chief executive officer being the person who runs the business on a day-to-day basis, try to keep those two separate so that the chances of collaboration and wrongdoing, in a sense, that's minimized. The choice of particular theoretical perspective depends on contractual factors, or contextual factors, I should say, such as the board power, environmental uncertainty, and information asymmetry. Contextual means that the business works within a context, and the opportunities for the managers to behave in a certain way depends on what the business is doing at a particular moment in time and which way the business is moving at that particular moment in time. It's contractual as well, because there is a contract between the managers and the owners of the business. Sometimes it may be an implicit contract, that it's assumed that the managers will work in the interest of the business and work in the interest of the shareholders. In fact, the managers are working in their own interest. Now, clearly there is some sort of correspondence between the two, because if the managers work completely in their own interest, it may be to the detriment of the business. It may be detrimental to the survival of the business. So there is a contractual agreement between them. Sometimes it's not an articulated contractual agreement, it's not a written one, but there is an understanding between the two sides that the business must survive. It's in both their parties' interest, both the shareholders and the managers, that the business survives. But how much power should the board of directors have? And what's the nature of the business? For example, it may be experiencing considerable competition from overseas because of globalization, or there may be technological change within the sector which is putting pressure on the business. So the power of individuals within the business may be changing because of the environment is changing. Customers' expectations are changing. The product has to be changed. There's also asymmetry. Asymmetry means that one side knows more than the other. And generally speaking, the managers know more than the shareholders. The shareholders are not involved in the business on a day-to-day basis. So the shareholders don't know who the customers are, perhaps they don't understand where what the buying arrangements for raw materials and components are. There's an asymmetry. The owners are in a very weakened position. The managers have much more information. And therein lies the problems of the control of the managers. How to control the managers when they've got so much information and so much power. Though there are different perspectives regarding the firm, many of these theoretical perspectives are intended as complements to, not substitutes for, agency theory. So there are many theoretical perspectives of the firm. Economists have books on this. It starts with classical statements about profit maximization, and where the company is seen as set out to maximize its profits. There are also theories related to the sales maximization hypothesis, postulating that companies aim to try and sell as much as possible. There are models about the growth of the business, models associated with the growth of sales of the business. So there are many different perspectives that economists have worked out over the years. But it all comes back to this most practical problem, the problem of how businesses are run in detail and the conflicting interests between the managers, the agents if you like, and the principals, the owners. So even though we've got different perspectives of the business, they all seem to fit within this overarching debate about the conflict between these two groupings. Review of different perspectives clarify that there is need to take an integrated approach rather than a single perspective to understand the effect of good corporate governance. It would seem reasonable to suggest that we recognize the internal workings of the business and the potential conflicts that exist within the business, but at the same time perhaps the overall thrust of the business, the overall direction of the business is in a particular way to try and emphasize the importance of profits or emphasize the importance of sales. It depends on what its strategy is, what it's trying to do in the medium to long term periods. So whilst at the same time remembering that the company is composed of individuals who have their own agendas, the overall direction in which the business is moving could be pushed in a certain way, perhaps to grow the sales of the business to try and get greater market power, or to compete more effectively with competitors, or to deal with high levels of imports of competitor imports, for example. So it's trying to get an overall perspective of the business that's the problem. And this overall perspective, as I said, should bear in mind the internal conflict, but at the same time try and get some direction to the business. Agency theory places primary emphasis on shareholders' interest. Stakeholder theory places emphasis on taking care of the interest of all stakeholders, not just the shareholders. So when we think about corporate governance, we think about agency theory, this quite narrow conflict between the managers and the shareholders, but stakeholder theory would look at the wider implications for the actions of the business and how those actions impinge upon the welfare of the various groups, the employees, for example, the suppliers, the local community. So stakeholder theory is wider than agency theory. Agency theory focuses in on this relationship between the agents and the principals, between the managers and the owners, whereas stakeholders include these other groupings. To gain a greater understanding of board processes and dynamics, there is a need to integrate different theories rather than consider any single theory. And that's what I was saying earlier. The economists bring quite a few theories to the table. They bring profit maximization, as I said, sales maximization, and various theories. It's important, however, to realize that there are, whilst these may constitute, I should say, the direction in which the business is moving, the internal strife that goes on within the business still exists. So the overall perspective of the business as having a coherent single direction is not necessarily a valid one. It is more perhaps that the business aspires to move in a particular direction, but it must also cope with the fact that there are different objectives and different desires on the part of different agents within the business. So it's very difficult to see businesses as having one very clear corporate direction. What they will have is compromise. They'll have negotiated compromise. They'll have internal disputes and issues. There will be issues associated with the application of policies and directions within the business. Perhaps the managers don't agree and they're pulling in a different direction. The board of directors might be pulling in yet a different direction. There might be a conflict between the chief executive officer and the chairman. But from the outside, we see the business as pursuing perhaps very clear and very unambiguous methods and following a particular line of development. Whereas the truth is it's brewing up on the inside, in the sense that there is a lot of conflict, a lot of issues to be resolved, a lot of negotiations, a lot of compromise, and it's not as clear-cut as we can imagine. So corporate governance is a very important subject because it does affect the profitability of the business, it affects the cost of the business, it affects the efficiency of the business in terms of the ways in which they can go about achieving their objectives. But even setting the objectives themselves are a problem, and there are issues associated there. And there are different power relationships, as I said earlier. The managers, generally speaking, have a lot of power. They understand the business, they understand the products, they understand the processes. They have the more direct relationships with the suppliers. They know the capability of the employees and what's required for efficient working. The owners of the business don't have this knowledge, but they are the owners, and that's where the problem resides. So that's all I'm going to deal with here. Let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.